Before we get into the stories, I would like to let you all know that I'm taking story submissions to narrate. I will credit you in the description of the video unless you ask me not to, so if you have an experience or story in mind that you would like me to read, then you can email me at feedingonfear@gmail.com, and I will be sure to include it in my videos. Thank you so much for watching, and enjoy the stories. I can't stand children. I've avoided them for a long time. Their presence gives me chills and heavy memories I swore I'd never speak of again with this sinful mouth. But today I broke another promise. My life is thoroughly uncomfortable. I'm old and starting to forget simple things. At this moment, I feel no desire to continue my existence. And so I reveal a secret in this cursed letter, along with my story. A secret that cannot die with me. I'm old and sick, and the rope that waits for me in the center of this basement has a knot tied with the courage I've always lacked. Forgive me if you can for what I'm about to tell you, but courage, revolt, and paranoia outweigh the shame at this moment. And if resting eternally in peace is a possibility, then this will be my wretched ticket to redemption. As I was saying, the shame is palpable, and the horror that's been omnipresent throughout my life. The unfortunate story begins in the northern lands. I was always a simple and very quiet boy with no great passion. The years passed, and I grew. Then the colonial war broke out in 1961, and the shooting started in Africa. I was called for service 4 years after the conflict began, when I received my assignment in Angola, the so-called Hell of War. Somehow, which I still don't understand today, all my quietness and peacefulness left me to prove some courage, and I almost felt fulfilled. The arrival was striking. The differences were stark. The atmosphere as described, depressive, stressful, and terrifying. I felt terrible as soon as I arrived. I saw horrifying things in the war zone that pushed me into extreme anxiety, noticeable to any comrade who crossed paths with me. I witnessed shameful and disturbing acts whose memories have haunted me ever since. They became a shadow over my consciousness. My inability to react quickly in moments of an enemy attack led me to being scorned and excluded by my battalion. All that gunfire and bomb noise left me paralyzed, unable to react. They said my bravery was insufficient, and therefore I wasn't worthy of being on the battlefield. They quickly reassigned me to new duties. Of all the possibilities that crossed my mind when I thought of potential scenarios, none were as repugnant as the sad reality that awaited me. All my colleagues who weren't on the front lines lived tranquil lives. Simple cooks, warehouse chiefs, mechanics. They all lived more peacefully while others dodged bullets and bombshells. It was clear that almost all these privileges were obtained through bribery and favors. Everyone was robbing somebody. I was then assigned, along with 3 captured deserters, to destroy evidence of misconduct by our soldiers. That's how the project was presented to us, with patriotic emphasis and utmost secrecy, through promises, threats, and manipulation. Little did I know that my life would go from an authentic horror to an unbearable hell. The program involved eliminating any trace of sexual abuse by Portuguese troops. We were tasked with traveling through all the tribes in the vast kilometers around our camps and starting this horrible, abominable strategy to obscure the reality of what was happening. It's, as I've said, deeply shameful for me to recount these events. Wish they were the product of some disturbed imagination. So, together with my 3 colleagues, we began traversing the tribes in the designated perimeter. The shock was brutal. In just over 4 years of war, the behavior of our soldiers, unworthy even of animals, had tainted those populations with fear and disgust. Every small village had at least 2 or 3 mixed children. Obviously the offspring of war and the devil. Deprived of weapons due to our lack of dignity, we had to solve the problem as best we could. We stained hundreds of walls with the innocent blood of children born from the abuse. And as selfish as this thought might be, I still believe that our lack of courage inflicted on us a torture as great as that we had inflicted on the children. It destroyed us in every sense of the being. The dirty work assigned to us involved identifying the light-skinned children of the expected age and, without momentary scruples, sucking life out of them. The mothers who cared for the brats with the same love they had for the event that led to their conception hardly grieved the loss of being so close yet so rejected. Our army had taken control of the tribe's means of survival, and because of this, fear instilled in them a strange kind of loyalty and respect. For these reasons, it became easy to carry out and silence our sins. Threats and disdain silence the mouths that shan't speak. All mixed children around the age of 3 were wiped out on the walls of their own homes, leaving a mark, a sort of warning that what had happened would not be spoken of. This was our legacy, and the deaths of innocent little ones suffering from the terrors of their animalistic fathers that they would never meet. We 4 were the chosen ones to bear the weight of that guilt and the sins for the rest of our lives. As for my companions in this terrible mission, I knew them as Tristan, Samuel, and Romano. I knew nothing about their lives or their motivations for fleeing the war, and they knew little about mine. I introduced myself only by my first name, Claudio. For weeks, we continued doing what was required. And during all the insanity provoked by what we lived, Tristan couldn't bear it and decided to end his own life. I partially can't even blame him for it. Somehow he found the strength and the courage and the means to take the final step, leaving us to continue the dirty work. I think I found that same courage today after so much research. We eventually moved past the grief without correcting anything, and we continued, in an act of great weakness, to stain our once innocent hands in monstrous rivers of blood. Then things changed abruptly, and the events that brought me home occurred. We were walking, as usual, unarmed, which didn't scare us much for the reasons I mentioned earlier. But one day something unusual happened. The villagers inexplicably reacted to our reactions. They wouldn't let us touch or even approach a child. One specific child, a child unlike any we'd ever seen. We were all stunned when we saw, in the midst of them, a white child, unmistakably white, whiter than me. She had crystal clear blue eyes, blonde hair, and a freckled face. For us, it was shocking to see that child because we couldn't explain or justify it. The girl had all the features of her black countrymen. Her wide nose and thick pink lips stood out on a face so pale and so beautiful. Even though we felt that child wasn't what we were looking for, we decided to approach. Panic immediately ensued. Everyone around us became alert. As soon as Samuel approached to touch the girl's hair out of curiosity, we were attacked. This had never happened before. We had no firepower to defend ourselves, and a group of them fell upon us. Cries of "Protect the angel" and "Take her away" echoed repeatedly. It became clear that this child was very important to them. When we found ourselves subdued by an unprecedented fury, we were powerless and outnumbered, and misunderstood with no means of defense. Samuel was knocked down, and in an attempt to help him, Romano and I retaliated, only to suffer twice as much. Romano was slashed with some giant blade and fell to the ground. My leg was quickly destroyed by the attacks I suffered, and when I realized Samuel had surrendered without further resistance, I quickly followed suit, and a glimmer of mercy shone from their faces. They spared us what life we had left. We were taken, then mutilated, to a Portuguese patrol zone. By the afternoon, we were finally retrieved by our own soldiers. I woke up hours later in the military hospital. My leg had to be amputated on a palm's length above the knee. 2 beds to my right lay Samuel, restless but whole, at least more whole than I was. I could tell something wasn't right with him. He twisted and trembled violently and screamed things like, "The little angel, it was the angel of death." After all these events, we were interrogated by senior officers, who realized we were useless in any task, even one as humiliating and terrifying as the one we had, and they allowed us to return home. I've lived alone ever since, distancing myself from family in my homeland. I never saw Samuel's face again. He was admitted to a psychiatric hospital upon his return, as I later found out. We exchanged letters and postcards occasionally, but the content was almost always depressing, imaginary, and rarely engaging. Still, I thought it proper to communicate with him, at least that way. After all, he was the only one who understood what my pain was, because it was his too. Unfortunately, he died. A few days ago, some of his belongings arrived at my house. A few things, along with the sad news of his death. It seems mine was the only address listed in his record. I am the very last of us 4. My fate is a sad one. Since I returned to Portuguese soil, I've never heard mention of the children who died by my hand. No one knows they ever existed. Source of pride for the officers who sought secrecy, and an endless sorrow for myself. None of the parents who married off their children, honorable warriors, ever knew the true atrocities they committed in Portuguese Africa. No wife ever learned the cruelty of her brave husband, who had a street named after him by the church. Only I know the truth now. All my partners in the mission are dead. I am the remaining one. The officers who orchestrated the task were killed, along with my platoon, in a surprise attack on the facilities shortly after I returned home. I cannot bear the burden of the truth alone, and that is why I avoid children. They remind me of the evils that I committed. The blood, the stains, they recall the horror that I experienced. I live in sadness from the torment that insists on reminding me of every sin I've committed, hammering the memories into my mind like unbearable ticks. I leave it recorded here, with the force of my last breath of courage, my sin alongside the greatest sin of Portugal, so that the truth does not die with me. I don't want that selfishness in my final moments. I leave for posterity what the heroes of the sea were capable of doing. The rope is waiting for me. It almost seems to be calling to me. Claudio sits the pen down on the table, and the cigarette he was smoking, still half burnt into an ashtray, overflowing with cigarette butts. He heads toward the center of the basement, and with great effort prepares his final breath of life. He hangs himself, and there's an intense smell of smoke. Something was burning near the ashtray. It was the whole truth.